Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming out. November, a dry evening in November. We have had so many lectures when people have come here with dripping umbrellas and all the rest of it. So it's great to be here. Great to be back at the Museum of Vancouver, and of course to be speaking on a favorite topic of an area where I lived back quite some years ago. uh, 1970s, 1980s. Can't afford to live here now, but we'll get into that a little bit as we go through. I just want to want to acknowledge, as we all acknowledge the City of Vancouver archives, that none of us who do what we do could do what we do without the archives being there. And my connection to the archives goes back to 1973. Walking in the door of their being welcomed in there, I wanted to write an article or a couple of articles on Kitsilano history for this little local newspaper that I'll be referring to later on. So 51 years later, bit of a change of staff. Hi, Heather. A bit of a change of staff in the archives over those years, but they're still there, and they're the most remarkable stewards of our history. So we're talking tonight about an area called Kitsilano. Now this is a Stolo map. So the Stolo, the people of the river, that's the Musqueam people. So you're not really seeing that much of an acknowledgement on the map of the Squamish people and the Tsleil-Waututh people who are also here. But our particular spot is right there. And Senakw, a name that means, as I understand it, inside at the head. So at the head of False Creek, just around the corner from where the head is, that was where the village of Senakw was. For not sure how long, but for many, many, many years before our settlement and before there was a city of Vancouver. Getting an idea of what this place was like when settlement began, you can see this enormous timber lease for the Hastings Mill. That's the sawmill on the Vancouver waterfront, what we would now say foot of Main Street effectively. And on the basis of that sawmill, the little community of Gastown got going. And but you see these other things, they're government reserves. So these are reserves from effectively the Royal Naval Survey of 1859, 1860. One of them being Stanley Park, of course, another one being Jericho. You think of the sort of layers of history going on there. And then the Indian reserves, as they were called. The one down on the bottom there, the Musqueam Reserve to this day. And then the one that we're referring to tonight, the Indian Reserve 1869 there, that is the Senakw part of Kitsilano. And then the settlers' farms, so that's the McClearys and the McGees and the Moles who settled on the Fraser River in the early 1860s. They were effectively, what would you call them, unsuccessful gold prospectors who decided that what they would do is they would start farming. Another really significant thing for where we are is the land grant that was given to the Canadian Pacific Railway for arriving out here at the coast. And you know, the railways, transportation, all about land. Notice Trafalgar Street and Ontario Street. When you're familiar with those streets, you realize that the avenues that are coming in on either side of that take little jogs in some places because the surveys don't all line up. And so the reason for that is because the CPR and their survey had this entire area, this district lot 526, and then they also had the unsold lands in on the downtown peninsula. So that brings us to 1905, and the Canadian Pacific Railway decides that it's going to open up this area, and they're looking around for a name for it. And there was a quite prominent anthropologist here by the name of Charles Hill Tout. Hill-Tout. And he had been doing some archaeological investigation down along the Fraser River and so on. And he recommended to the CPR that they name it after Chief Kitsilano of the Squamish Nation, who didn't actually live on this Senakw spot. He lived at one of the villages in what's now Stanley Park, near Lumberman's Arch. And so 1905, Kitsilano gets named. And by that time, the Kitsilano Beach was known as Greer's Beach, and it was a popular place for people to spend their summer holidays. They would come from the smoky downtown Vancouver with the mills and so on, and come out and pitch tents and spend good portions of the summer there. Now, the name Greer, where does that come from? Well, Sam Greer, he was one of the true ne'er-do-wells of our history, described as a scoundrel by Judge Matthew Bailey Begbie when sentencing Greer to jail for stealing and I guess you would say ripping off some Indigenous people out in the Fraser Valley. And I'm not going to go too much into that because we have a very, very good lecture on our YouTube site by Laura Ishiguro, done a few years ago on Sam Greer's battle for Kitsilano. Sam Greer claimed that he had purchased Kitsilano from the Indigenous people, and so that it was his land around the beach there particularly. And when the sheriff came to evict him, Sam Greer shot through the door and injured the sheriff, and ended up doing even more jail time on that. But I recommend very, very highly, and I'm going to keep referring back to our set of YouTube lectures that we have on the site. You get this really fantastic view, and this Sam Greer character, if we were in the United States, he would have a TV series after him, let's put it that way. He's an interesting character. I'm going to be referring back to this map a couple of times in what we're doing here. So where we are sitting now at the Museum of Vancouver, we're just up off the top of the screen. And you'll see that it says vacant Indian lands there, and then vacant Indian lands south of that. Now, that right-of-way there, the diagonal right-of-way, that's the Burrard Bridge right-of-way. So land taken away from the original Indian Reserve in 1930. We will be referring back to that a little bit later, but it's this right-of-way here, the Canadian Pacific Railway right-of-way that went right through the Indian Reserve in 1886. The intention of the Canadian Pacific Railway at that time, or at least what they were investigating, was doing a deep sea port and an industrial area out where what we now call Jericho and Spanish Banks. Why would they want to be out there? Well, no difficult first narrows to go through. Much more accessible, more open land, that sort of thing. And so the CPR put a right-of-way through there, and they actually extended the tracks out as far as the foot of Trafalgar Street. So that's the western end of their land grant. And this was in the 1880s. Now notice also on this map that curve that heads off to the bottom of the map there. That's a railway line that they put in 1902 to connect the Vancouver port with Steveston. Why Steveston? Salmon canning. The nickname for Steveston at that time was Salmonopolis. And actually only for 3 years, the Canadian Pacific Railway ran trains on that line. That's the line or the right-of-way that we now call the Arbutus Corridor. But in 1905, the Canadian Pacific decided they weren't going to try to open up a port on, Kitsilano foreshore, Jericho foreshore, and so they leased this rail line to the BC Electric Railway Company. It crossed Falls Creek on a little trestle that anybody who was here before 1985 will remember. The uh, this photograph I took in 1982 of it, and this was removed in just before Expo to, I guess, allow easier access into False Creek for yachts and so on. I'm only being slightly sarcastic in saying that, but this was the transition of False Creek from being an industrial area into being a kind of a residential, almost a resort area. And if you wanted to get to Kitsilano, because of course it was the advantage of what had become Kitsilano Beach, the former Greer's Beach, you'd pick up a streetcar downtown. So this is the number 12 Kitsilano line. This looks to me like it's the corner of Pender and Granville Street. Nothing has changed there. And this would be a photograph from the 1940s, I'm thinking, based on the guy in the uniform who's striding out to get on the streetcar. Who were the early people who built houses in Kitsilano? Theodore Calland was a real estate dealer. Probably this would be no surprise. Doing quite well. And he built just west of Trafalgar in 1904, so just west of the CPR lands. Really quite a beautiful house. The story is that he rode a horse to work downtown for the first few years. And then once the streetcar got established, that he took to that. But he was very, very active in that area. And this house was torn down at some point about 1950. I don't know for sure. I've never really investigated it. Another one of the early people, Robert Douglas Rorison, he was in real estate too, no surprise. And he built this big house on Point Grey Road in 1908 using timbers from the English Bay Cannery, which was at the foot of Bayswater. So that would be right in front of Chip Wilson's house, if it were still there. But apparently that cannery had a fire, and once it burned, they just decided they would demolish it, and some of the timbers went into building this very, very, very fine Queen Anne house. Another of the early settlers, John and Jessie Hall. Now, Jessie Hall was Jessie Greer. She was Sam Greer's daughter. And you would think with a lineage like Sam Greer's that she would maybe be a bit of an adventurer or something like that. In fact, she was a stalwart of the Conservative Party in British Columbia. She became one of the most establishment kind of socially and politically connected women in Vancouver at that time. And then you'll recognize our Point Grey Road at Bayswater, and that is right next door to Tatlow Park. And Captain Tatlow, he was the Minister of Finance in the provincial Conservative government of that day. And he died tragically when the carriage that he was being pulled in through the streets of Victoria, the horses bolted. The carriage went over, and Tatlow was killed. And I believe on the basis of that they decided that they would name Tatlow Park. And Tatlow Park, of course, has been in the news lately because Tatlow Creek has been daylighted all the way through. So being put back in a way to its natural state. Another of the early houses, William Forrest, he was a CPR land agent. You know, we've got a sort of a real estate theme going here of the early people who were here. And he sold to Captain Cates. That's the tugboat running family that you know, I think that company is still going in North Vancouver to this day. But that very, very fine house on the right-hand side, it is still there. It's been moved up to the front of the lot just in the last year or two, I think. So how did the beach get going? The city had to buy the land between Cornwall Avenue and the high tide mark from the CPR, and you can see the difference in prices. An indication of what a land price boom there was between 1909 and 1913. If the city had waited 3 or 4 years to buy that eastern side of the beach, they probably could have got it for about half the amount of money. There was an enormous real estate crash just after, well, really beginning in 1913. But you can see the crews cleaning the rocks off the beach, the right-of-way of the railway up above, and if you can maybe pick out a couple of buildings there, that would be the terminus of the Kitsilano streetcar line at about the foot of Vine Street. And the houses that were built along there, this was 35 years ago when I did this watercolor. You can see there's a kind of a catwalk that crosses from the Cornwall sidewalk over to the first floor of this funny little apartment building that was there. There were all these dips and humps and everything that were never filled in. Just the Cornwall Street itself was leveled off, and so you had you had this kind of curious evolved houses, rooming houses, and small apartment buildings that were there at that time. Ogden Street, that's just at the end of Kitts Point here. And a terrific photograph from 1918 of people coming down for a day at the beach with their cars and picnicking and so on. One of the things I like so much about this photograph is that people have cut and pulled some of the bush, probably the scrub bush that's along there, to pack around their tires so that the tires wouldn't become cracked in the hot sun. So you can see particularly that one that's on the right-hand side, the guy doesn't want to buy another set of tires after that. And the old bathhouse, built by that time, built, I believe, 1915 or so. And you can see from this photograph in the background, you can do your Vancouver detective thing and you say, okay, this has got to be early 1960s, right? Because you've got the BC Electric, could be the BC Hydro building at that point, and the Burrard building that is there, the kind of second one in from the left. So that gives you a sort of an idea of where that was. And quite soon after this photograph was taken, that bathhouse was torn down and replaced by the bathhouse that was torn down about 10 years ago, I would say. But looking very, very much like the Kitts Beach that we know of crowds of people and everybody hanging out. And the little beach community developed. And this Saju Terrace, that is Ann Terrace, who was a photographer who lived on Kitts Point, and took a number of very nice photographs of the area. So this is the bottom of U Street. You can see the beach in the distance. And you'll notice there's a man there who is spraying a hose onto just on the right-hand side. And that's one of these little bungalows that used to be there, and an indication of what density meant 100 years ago, I guess, that on the lot, this single lot there were 5 of these little prefab bungalows that the owner bought and erected there. So a little collection of these houses, and they were demolished in the 1970s. There is still in the back lane, the lane just behind there is still a lane house, one of the very, very rare indications of that kind of settlement. But it gives you an idea of how that beach community developed, and very different from 3-4 blocks to the west of that, where you had effectively mansions that were being built at that time. We go over to West Kitts, 4th and Dunbar, and it comes into the saga of this family, the Quinneys, James Quinney particularly, and who settled. They were the first house out in that part of Kitsilano in 1908, northeast corner of 4th and Dunbar. And it was a relatively wild and crazy place at that time. according to the story, that James Quinney responded to a call for help from some loggers. They were South Asian loggers who were working in the area of about 16th and Collingwood, that they were being harassed by a bear. And Quinney went up to shoot the bear, as people do, or people did, but then discovered that the bear had a cub. So he took the bear cub home, and the bear lived with them until, I guess, it began to develop adult bear tendencies. And apparently it then went down to Stanley Park and the beginnings of the Stanley Park Zoo. But these rather charming photographs of Kitsilano at that time, they didn't stay very long at that 4th and Dunbar house. They moved into little cottages at 2nd and Waterloo. And this is part of what he was doing at that time. He was a real estate dealer. Our theme of real estate dealing goes along there, and you might be able to pick out on the house in the distance there, James Quinney Real Estate. He was selling real estate for Rorison, the man with the big turreted house that we were talking about before. And these houses lasted through until 2000. I sort of knew of them, and I knew of the story of them, and went by with my sketchbook one day shortly before they were demolished in 2000. Replaced by much bigger houses, and but that was the connection with James Quinney, and what was, a pretty, what would you say, rural place. This looks like Vancouver Island last week, I think you would say, and not there's no real identifier of where this place is, but you see that it's, just in the process of being logged off and cleared, but somebody's already built a house on it. These things work because of transportation. And it was the opening of the streetcar line out into that area that made it possible for people to buy lots and build houses and kind of have a life, an early 20th century life, because probably only a handful of them had cars at that time. You'll note the J. Quinney Real Estate sign, and below that it says the 540 special. That's District Lot 540, the area that is out there in that part of Kitsilano. And this is what the rest of the community looked like. That building on the right was the Kitsilano Public School, built in 1907, 1908. So between U and Vine, on the north side of 4th Avenue. And when that was torn down, it became a car dealership. I had to look up in an old directory. It was Plymley Motors. I see heads nodding. I could not remember the name of the dealership at that point. And you see the streetcar tracks there, and then one of Vancouver's finest just checking out the area on his horse. And another very early, very grainy view looking down what appears to be the board sidewalk going down the hill of Arbutus Street. Sort of 1910, somewhere in that vicinity, and particularly there's the bathhouse that has been built down along the shoreline. There's some of the big houses that were built. You think about the evolution of a community, and this house here that faces into the lane north of 3rd at U Street. It started off facing U Street, but in the 1930s, the owner skidded it around the corner in order to build an apartment building on the remaining site. So this kind of infill and density, it's not a new idea. That people have been doing that for a very long time. And waiting for rush hour on 4th Avenue west of McDonald. I'm not sure that that little Kitsilano repair shop is still there. It was there until quite recently, one of the small buildings from that time. But the area developed with beautiful houses before the First World War. Um, a lot of craftsman style houses, just builders' houses, but very, very well built houses. And this piece of 6th Avenue, now there are a number of streets that would equal this, but this has all of the combination of things that I think make Kitsilano such a wonderful area, that you've got the old houses that are well maintained, you've got this mixture of colors and textures, you've got a mixture of renters and owners, because most of these houses have suites in them. Um, it's beautifully sun-dappled on a summer day, so to me it just catches that. This is, I think John referred to me as heritage aesthetic or aesthete or something like that. This look of Vancouver in that light is something that I think is just irreplaceable. And people would say, well, what's unique about Vancouver? Well, maybe this isn't unique, but it's very, very unusual to have neighborhoods like this that are more than 100 years old and have this kind of evolution going on with them. Same McDonald Street. I painted this in 1990, I think it says, or maybe 1989, and all those houses are still there, and they're well maintained. So the greenest building is the one that's already built, and so on and so forth. These are 1911 houses, 1910, 1911 houses in a kind of a builder's style. By the end of the First World War, that styles had begun to change. People certainly weren't as wealthy after the First World War as they had been before the First World War. And also there seemed to be a move towards smaller families. And so smaller houses were what people would get. And so these California bungalows, as they were called, or Pasadena bungalows, they were built all over the city, but probably the best row of them that's in the city is this one here on 5th Avenue, west of Bayswater. And there were other houses too. This one just off Cornwall, and was moved a little bit on its lot and then was infilled with an apartment building a number of years ago. So how did this evolution happen? And was it unique to Kitsilano? No, it wasn't, but it's an indication of a, I guess, a type of society at that time that would adapt things, that things would evolve. And partly economically, they were thinking that, but partly just an attitude that people had. So you'd have sort of a typical builder's house like this, and it would have a basement suite, probably quite a nice main floor suite that might be the owner, or it might just be one of the tenants. The floor above that could well have been housekeeping rooms, shared bathroom and kitchen, and then maybe a garret, an attic suite. So these houses were divided up quite well. And interestingly, when you look at how the houses were divided and why it was done, how it was done so successfully, was because on the narrow lots, the builders put the staircase on one side. So therefore you had the entryway on one side and the staircase going up one side. And it became very, very easy to divide the houses up into slices vertically. And so this was the Kitsilano of post-war, and boom in university population in the 1960s. Hippie population turned it into a kind of a Haight-Ashbury North, and so this was the period when I was living in Kitsilano, first period when I was living in Kitsilano, and working with a group of people on a little newspaper called Around Kitsilano that we were just putting out as a group of volunteers. And I did this drawing in 1974. I think we were selling copies of it for 25 cents at the sort of Kits days of the period for kids to color. this sort of Superman character flying up there, if you were able to see it really closely, he's got an R on his front, not an S. And the R is for rentals man. And the office of the rentals man was one of the decisions of the NDP government, the Dave Barrett government of that period, to try to put some tenant protection in during a period of an extreme housing shortage. Now, this is 50 years ago, and we're back in that same situation again, but history does tend to repeat itself in Vancouver. And the rentals man was a former a CKWX hotliner, and I think he'd been an MLA, a man by the name of Barry Clark, and he did this for a few years, and then the housing crisis eased a little bit, and there was a change of government that came in. But this was Kitsilano, happy Kitsilano, sure with a housing shortage, but in the early 1970s. Night places, Village Bistro was on the north side of 4th Avenue, just east of Arbutus Street. Folk music and folk rock coffee club. So it was, yes, it was everything like that. Probably not as famous in the history as the Afterthought, the one that is just west of Kitsilano in the old Russian Community Hall, which had some of the big bands that came through at that time. Maybe you can pick out a few of the names of the familiar businesses from that period. The one on the left-hand side, where the psychedelic lettering got a little out of control, was the Golden Lotus Vegetarian Restaurant, and then more on the east end, over by Burrard, Lifestream Natural Foods. That was a business of Aaron Stevens, Aaron and Retana Stevens, and had a very, very long successful career with natural foods. Another Ann Terrace photo of kids and parents at Henry Hudson School, and of course the NAM. Really, I think the last survivor on its original site in Vancouver. The Banyan Books is still going, but it's moved around a number of times. And the NAM, there was a rumor that it was going to close and it was going to be sold, but that seems to have been withdrawn. I haven't heard anything lately about that happening. We can't do anything about Kitsilano without mentioning Volkswagens at that period. So, but what I'll do is again recommend that if you want a more in-depth look at that period, and not just in Kitsilano, but all over Vancouver, another one of the YouTube lectures. This one I think I did in 2022, but really focusing on the politics and all of the activism of the period. You'll remember R.D. Rorison's house, one of the early houses on Point Grey Road. In the 1960s and the 1970s, it was known as the Peace House. And this dates from a group of anti-nuclear activists led, or at least the one name that I know attached to it is a man by the name of Peter Light. And they were protesting the suggestion that nuclear arms were going to be put onto the Comox Air Force Base. House got dubbed the Peace House, and then it went into the legend that nobody has ever completely sorted out, that this is where the Grateful Dead stayed. This is where Allen Ginsberg stayed. And they're just terrific rumors. And I don't know anybody who could prove one way or another whether it happened, but it did have certainly a well-earned reputation as a party house. And this is it today after what I would describe as a rather unsympathetic modification 40 years ago. But one of the things that we look at about this area is how it fits in with this narrative of deindustrialization followed by gentrification. No surprise that Kitsilano is going to be a very attractive place for people to come to live in. And so the scene here in 1988 with a lot of the houses in disrepair. The railway there is still the industrial railway running along. It still had freight trains running on it, and most of the houses were rooming houses, were not in very good condition. And so I went back. I went back with my paint box a couple of years ago, and of course the trees have grown up beautifully. The railway line is gone. It's now Arbutus corridor, very nice for walking and cycling, lined with allotment gardens, but it indicates just a real change in the economy in Vancouver. The area that the freight trains were serving at that time, up around 10th and 12th and Arbutus in that area, that's all gone residential. Everything has gone residential. The houses have been painted, the houses have been fixed up. In some cases, the houses have been converted all the way back into being single family, but that's not necessarily the case. And left around from an earlier era is this Delamont Park at, well, really Delamont Park itself is between 6th and 7th, that green area there. Named for Arthur Delamont, who was the leader for many years of the Kitsilano Boys Band. Why did the city buy this land up? What was that all about? Well, in the planning document of the 1920s, the Harland-Bartholomew Plan, it envisaged a roadway, a 6-lane roadway that was going to be called the Burrard-Arbutus Connector. And it was going to follow that curve of the railway tracks along the Arbutus corridor now and make it easier for vehicles to come up Burrard Street, do that turn in the big loop onto Arbutus, and then head south into Kerrisdale without disturbing anybody in Shaughnessy, effectively, because Burrard Street just goes up to 16th Avenue. And the area there, old houses, fairly well maintained, a lot of co-op houses, a lot of very affordable housing, and a heritage area, and something that over, it's going on probably 30 years or longer. We're trying to get some decision out of the city to just keep it, keep it as an area of affordable housing and of the old housing. The one little piece that I think is not in any danger is the old Arbutus Grocery that is now a very successful coffee shop, as a lot of the old grocery stores have been. And they become a neighborhood hub and an increasingly kind of city of strangers, I suppose you would say. But people get together at these old grocery stores that have been converted. And but some of the houses, these houses are now, in some cases, the better part of 125 years old. So it is an old area and provides very good housing. Of course, now it's 3 blocks away from the terminus of the Broadway line, the current terminus of the Broadway line, and it falls within that radius of high-rises that has been mandated by the provincial government. So what will happen to it with the current mentality in Vancouver and Victoria is anybody's guess. But is this a new thing, a kind of threat there? Going back to this little community newspaper in 1973, one of the articles was that the Legion wanted to build a high-rise seniors housing project at 6th and Maple. And all of the people who were living there and were tenants of the Lions said, if you build a high-rise, it will be too expensive. Build low-rise. And so it ended up being the low-rise Lions little seniors housing project that's there to this day, and very successfully. Was that the only high-rise that was proposed for that area at that time? Well, no, and there had been a few about 12-story buildings that had built in the 1960s on the slope up above the beach. The one that really almost got built was a Ben Wask project, 2280 Cornwall. So that's between Vine and Balsam, right? Yes, between Vine and Balsam, and the plans were all approved. The zoning had been in for 10-story buildings for a number of years, but nobody had ever built anything above 3 stories. And it was just presumed that, oh, well, the zoning was more or less low-rise, and this was going to distinguish Kitsilano from the West End. Then Ben Wask read the zoning bylaw, and he applied, and he got approval to build a 10-story apartment building. And there was a real uproar led by the Vancouver Tenants Union and a man by the name of Bruce York, who became an alderman councillor for the Cope Party. And but a number of the nonpartisan association aldermen who were there, they looked at this and said, no, this isn't really right to have a high-rise right along the beach like that. And so there was a negotiation with Ben Wask, and he just cut the thing off at 3 stories. And that, it's got to look like it ought to be a taller building. It looks like its top never got built, and that's the case. So let's go back to the Senakw period. And the grandson of Chief Kitsilano, the Kitsilano's namesake, Chief Kitsilano, August Jack Kitsilano, and his wife and child, just right off the beach here, in about 1907, and just a quiet place, a village of not that many people, but this is part of the Kitsilano Indian Reserve, established. The part that we're on here, so you think of it being north of the Burrard Bridge, north of Cornwall, established in 1869. So 1869, British Columbia is still a British colony. It hasn't joined Canada yet. And then the part that is south of Burrard Street, established in 1877. All of this taking place before Vancouver is founded in 1886. So, you realize how early this is in the settlement history. The provincial government, the Richard McBride provincial government that was in power between 1902, 1903, and about 1916, it was determined to get a hold of Kitts Point because it saw it as a very, very advantageous industrial place. There were even rumors of a Ford Motor Company plant going onto the point here. And of course, the logic of the time was you had this easily accessible piece of ocean frontage. Some ways more accessible, certainly, than the Port of Vancouver in downtown Vancouver. And they were determined to get hold of it by fair means or foul, as was said at the time. And so going completely against the terms of confederation of British Columbia with Canada, the provincial government seized the Indian reservation, loaded the residents there onto barges, and the residents went off and up to their main reserve, which of course is just about at the north end of the Lionsgate Bridge, just east of there. That's all Squamish land at that point. And there was compensation paid, but it was not paid to the band. It was paid to a group of individuals. It was just patently illegal what the province did at that time. And to the point that after the war was over and the federal government began to get its house in order again, that the land was taken back by the federal government. I think a small amount of money changed hands between the federal government and the provincial government at that time. And so all this land, this illegal seizure of the Indian reservation, resulted in many, many years of litigation. And then finally, the Squamish Nation agreed to take a payment of $92.5 million for it in 2000. And so that land, all of the land, seemingly all of the land, except for those rights of way that are there, all of that was returned to the Squamish people. Once again, I'm going to send you back to our YouTube channel, and the best crash course in property law that you will ever get in an hour by Douglas Harris, the senior law faculty member at UBC, and lecture Property and Sovereignty, the Kitsilano Indian Reserve in the city of Vancouver. And it's very interesting, both for the specific kind of blow-by-blow history of this, but also because it gives you a clear idea of what the settler people coming in, the migrants coming in here, believed constituted property ownership, and the way that you determine property ownership by working the land in some way, by improving the land, versus the more traditional Indigenous idea of what property ownership was going to be. So I'm going to send you off after this to look up this and read that. There's one more piece in this, though, that is, we've managed to keep the city of Vancouver all squeaky clean out of this whole process so far. But then along comes the city of Vancouver's decision to build the Burrard Bridge. This coming out of the same planning document that was going to create that Burrard Arbutus connector I was just talking about a few minutes ago. City of Vancouver needed 8 acres at the south end of the bridge for its footings and the roadway and all the rest of it. And so it negotiated with the Squamish people for an amount of money. This is, really the first year of the Great Depression, so everything is pretty depressed at that point. But so they negotiate for about $45,000, but they set up this little commission of 3 men to hear delegations. And over 28 days, these 3 men, making $50 a day each, listened to bogus delegations, as Major Matthews described it, and ended up billing the Squamish Nation for almost $29,000 cost out of this $45,000. And J.S. Matthews, who was a friend of August Jack Kitsilano, J.S. Matthews, the city archivist, wrote, "A more scandalous proceeding I have never seen." And so, the city of Vancouver does not get out of this with its hands clean. 1935, you can sort of picture this, I think, because you see the Burrard Bridge on the left-hand side, more or less where this area. This is looking out over that south side, the southern part of the Kitsilano Indian Reservation. It did develop between the wars. That photograph that we just looked at was taken from First Avenue, looking across the undeveloped land. But the area that is over there east of Burrard Street, actually both sides of Burrard Street, was one of the most racially diverse areas in Vancouver at that time. You can probably pick up that the site of Senakw, as it was spelt in 2005 when I drew this little map. There was still squatter shanties there until the early 1960s. But it was both a South Asian area, an East Indian area, and a Japanese area. And why would that be particularly? Because of employment at the sawmills on False Creek. So that was a real draw for that area. And the Japanese area was called Kitsilano. And that fabulous sign in the background was directed at motorists on the Granville Bridge, Imperial Gasolines. But but this was Japanese area, and there were scattered Japanese Canadian buildings and churches and that going all the way across Fairview Slopes. It was also the first Sikh temple was at the corner of 2nd and Cypress, so a block west of Burrard Street. And it lasted until 1969 or 1970. And why was it taken down? Why did it move? Because the South Asian population moved with the sawmills from False Creek to the Fraser River. And so they moved onto that south slope of Vancouver and built their fabulous Gurdwara with Erickson Massey Architects on Southeast Marine Drive. And but that left this Sikh temple to be demolished and replaced by an apartment building. The area had all kinds of little cottages scattered through, and it was identified in this Harlan Bartholomew plan of 1930 as being a slum. So that means that it didn't conform to the beliefs of the people who were doing the plan effectively. It was a poor area, no kidding, but it had these little houses that lasted for quite a long time. So going up in our airplane here in 1919 and looking, and you can see the kind of headland of Kitts Point. And that line that goes across there, the first one is the Kitsilano Trestle, then the Granville Bridge goes there, and there are sawmills in the distance. I think these are the first sets of, part of the first sets of aerial photographs ever taken of Vancouver. And you can see the Kitsilano Indian Reserve there, kind of in the foreground, middle ground, I guess you would say, with clearing fires going on, and returned servicemen who were out of work were hired and paid to do logging on that area, to clear it off for something, for some kind of use. Nobody really knew what would happen with it yet. But because it was sort of abandoned and the economy was really slow for most of the 1930s, and certainly definitely slow in the, did I just say in the 1920s, definitely slow in the 1930s, that it became a popular area for people to come, and particularly for people of color to come. And the term that I'd heard over the years was Indian Reserve Beach, or Indian Beach sometimes. And I just heard the term brown-skin beach a few weeks ago. A friend Vivian, who grew up in, or didn't grow up, she was a little child in Kitsilano before the 1942 internment, before everybody was kicked off the coast. She told me that they always referred to it as brown-skin beach. So this is the beach area going around the point here that is now just part of Vanier Park. And it implies that the beaches were segregated, but they weren't. Joe Fortes, the black lifeguard who looked after English Bay Beach for years, he had died 10 years before this photograph was taken. He died in 1922. But the feeling was of people of color that they were not welcome on the public beaches, on Kitsilano Beach, and on Sunset Beach and in English Bay Beach. And so they took quite happily to this area that is just here where we are at Vanier Park, Indian Reserve Beach. Also at that time, in terms of swimming opportunities, and the only real segregation thing that I know of that was a public institution was was Crystal Pool just across False Creek from here. And until 1946, people of color were only able to swim there Tuesday mornings for a couple of hours, and otherwise they were specifically banned from it. So that was one of the matters that happened in the immediate post-war period, was that that bit of discrimination was removed. Another nickname for that area, Bennettville. So this is R.B. Bennett, the Prime Minister of Canada in the 1930s, um, sometimes nicknamed Rotten Bastard Bennett, sometimes Bonfire Bennett because he had a habit of talking really quickly. But much as in the States, where squatters communities, the homeless communities were dubbed Hoovervilles after the American president, that some of these squatters communities got a nickname of Bennettville in Canada. So this is what it looked like in the middle of the Depression. And then in the 1940s, the Royal Canadian Air Force takes over this area, and you can see the rows of storage buildings that are there from what was a very, very large storage depot for the RCAF during the Second World War and continuing on there through until they were gradually removed in the early 1960s. Early 1960s, you're looking at Centennial coming along. This building gets built. Museum of Vancouver and the Space Center. The first building, interestingly enough, I think the first building in the Vancouver area that pays any reference at all to Indigenous people because of the shape of the roof of a Salish hat, effectively. And so brand new building here about 1967, brand new Canadian flag at that time too. I just want to end, come very, very close to ending on this matter of Trutch Street that some of you may be aware of, that every few years, Joseph William Trutch's name comes up as being one of the evil people of the colonial period. And so there's a whole idea of renaming the street. And according to this story, the street has been renamed, but the signs are still there saying that it's Trutch Street. And the suggestion in this article was that it's been renamed to Musqueam View Street. I hadn't heard that exactly. If I had been involved in it, I would have left the Trutch Street signs up and put an X and made it Truth Street. Just so thinking about Trutch, who was he and why is he considered to be so, such a bad actor in this piece that you would want to erase his name from the historical record? Well, he was actually a bridge engineer who came north, and he built the Alexandra Bridge across the Fraser Canyon at Spuzzum. And it was that bridge that allowed Royal Engineers, so agents of Britain, to get up and aid the Inklakapmak people of the Fraser Canyon in their fight against American gold miners coming north. So, kind of interesting there that his bridge really helped retain the sovereignty of Britain and ultimately of Canada over British Columbia. He then went on and he had a monopoly on tolls on the Caribou Road, and he tried to enforce that. And so the colonial government weren't too thrilled with that. But he did get named as the Chief Commissioner of Lands and Works for British Columbia. And in 1867, he did what I think would be the reason why you would want to erase him or would want to recognize him as a bad actor. And I'm not being woke in saying this particularly, but what he did in 1867 is that he reduced the size of the Indian reserves that had been put together previously by the colonial government by 91%, down to less than 10% of what had been agreed upon by the previous generation under Governor Douglas. And then he made it impossible for Indigenous people to preempt land. Now, the preemption of land, and this refer you back to that Douglas Harris talk on property rights and land rights. If you came here as a settler, you could take up 80 acres of land. And if you improved that land, so that means that you cleared it or you started to farm it or something like that, you could, in theory, get the next 80 acres next to it. So for farming, for that type of thing, you could do that. Initially, that had been open to everybody, but Trutch made it impossible for Indigenous people to preempt land. So not only had they been reduced, had their reserves been reduced by 90%, but they couldn't participate in the new economy. They couldn't become actors on the same footing as the settlers who were coming in. So I think that's where that's coming from, and it will be interesting to see what happens with this over the next few years. And then that brings us to Senakw, the new Senakw being built. And so this artist's view of the area there, I flagged Tom Campbell's Parkview Towers, which is just up the end of Chestnut Street here. And it's one of the landmark buildings of the 1950s, certainly for Kitsilano. And when Tom Campbell, who most of you will know later became mayor, he was mayor of Vancouver from 66 to 72, he was a small-time builder with big ambitions, both as a builder and then later on, of course, as a politician. And so he built the towers up there, and it was very, very tall, and there was some protest against it at that time. But what it did was it set in motion once and for all the end of the expansion of an industrial area on Kitts Point, because this area was effectively considered to be industrial until Tom Campbell got his way and he built the Parkview Towers. So we come forward into now, and of course, looking at this into the future, and you can see in this drawing, you can see that kind of Y shape again of where those towers are going. And if you think back to that map and the line that comes straight across from downtown to Kitts Beach, and then the one that swings off that and becomes the old interurban line that is now the Arbutus Corridor, then you've got this piece of land, this 10 acres, I believe it is, that the CPR took from the Indian Reserve and were never compensated for. And so when the CPR gave the land back to the Squamish people a few years ago, they went to town on a design for 3,000, I believe it's 3,000 units and 6,000 units, 6,000 units. Yes, I could never remember whether it's so 6,000, so probably 10,000 people who are in there and who are going to be living there. And every time I come over here for these lectures and I see the progress that is being made on that first set of towers, then you see there are going to be a lot of people here. And you look at this rather romantic view of the mouth of False Creek here with all the towers in the distance. This is what it will look like in the next few years. And or perhaps it's like this. And you know, you look at it and you say, transit deficient area. I hope they don't all call skip the dishes at once. But is this new, this idea of high rises for this area? The date on this, most of you can read that, adapted by City Council 2008. This is the eco-density charter that came out of Mayor Sam Sullivan's time as mayor of Vancouver. And so intent was Mayor Sullivan on the idea that dense concrete high-rises would make for a greener city, a kind of an eco-dense city, that he actually arranged to get a trademark of eco-density in his own name. And I don't know whether that is still the case, but he had city staff work on that to trademark that name. But in his view, all of Kitts Point would be high-rises. So, you know, this is not necessarily a new idea. This is now almost 20 years old. So a city of people in high-rises, this appears to be as the Broadway plan is moving forward with both the majority of the city and then the provincial government seemingly in favor of it. What this is doing for people who live in this area, who are tenants, and think about Vancouver as being more than 50% tenants, more than 50% renters. For Metro Vancouver, it's about 38% of the people who live in the area are tenants. And you think of these people just effectively having no rights and being moved out. And so I'll leave you with a thought, with a question really. We've talked about colonialism vis-a-vis Indigenous people, and Senakw, and a very, very good definition of colonialism, which my friend Lindsay gave to me, was colonialism is where people move into an area as if it's unoccupied. And so are we seeing a kind of a colonialism 2.0 with the new towers coming in, with people being evicted? People who are in relatively affordable housing now and they're being moved out. Is that what's happening? Or is this just inevitable for a desirable city on the Pacific Rim? No, I leave these thoughts with you, and be happy to take any questions, but thank you all for coming.